Hello and welcome. Let's take a look at the top story that we are tracking for you. Israel's coalition government has resumed debating the fiercely opposed judicial reform bill. The proposal aims to limit the Supreme Court's powers and curbs the ability to rule against the government. Now, the opposition has highlighted that if the bill is enacted, it would be a national disaster for the country's democracy. However, the Israeli government has now expressed that deliberations are underway to make the bill a softer version of what was previously proposed. According to the proposed amendments, Israel's courts will no longer be able to block executive decisions based on the extreme unreasonable doctrine. This doctrine currently allows courts to review administrative decisions which go beyond the scope of the government's reasonable authority. Another bill is expected to be moved by the government's Ministerial Committee on Legislation to weaken the Israel Bar Association, or the IBA. The association occupies 2 spots on the Judicial Selection Committee, which is responsible for the election of judges. The new bill could give the coalition government greater control over these spots, as it includes a clause that would entirely remove the IBA representatives from the committee. It is believed that the new council would be politically affiliated, as its members would be appointed by the government. Critics say this would weaken the judiciary and grant the executive more powers in the selection of judges. The government says the judicial reform is meant to control what it calls an overly interventionist Supreme Court. The contentious bill has triggered massive protests across the country, most notably in the city of Tel Aviv. This comes after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed last week to get the new legislation back on track.
Today, we're here to tell the government that we'll never stop, we'll never surrender. We're here to tell them that even though tomorrow they continue with the legislation, with the judicial reform, the overhaul, we'll never stop. We're here to show them that the Israeli people are not about any kind of dictatorship, nothing to do with rules and legislation that doesn't fit the Israeli democracy and the Israeli spirit of freedom.
Now, demonstrators have alleged that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu aims to use the judicial remodeling to scrap the bribery prosecution against him. Netanyahu is currently accused of graft in 3 separate cases of accepting bribes from powerful media moguls and wealthy industrialists. However, Netanyahu has shrugged off any wrongdoing in these cases. Now, for more on this, our correspondent Jody Cohen is joining us from Ra'anana. Hello to you, Jody. Now, deliberations underway to make this bill a somewhat softer version of what was previously proposed. Will this version be acceptable to the Israeli public?
Hi, Alison. So in what appears to be a win for the opposition, Prime Minister Netanyahu said that the original overhaul bill, which, remember, faced months of protests, is effectively dead. So now the coalition is focusing on a bill covering one issue from that original bill, that of the reasonableness clause. And that's being debated in the Justice Committee this week. Now, the judges would be able to judge the government decisions, but according to law, and not what judges consider to be reasonable or not. The government and their supporters think that the status quo gives the unelected judiciary too much power over the elected government. But the Justice Committee's legal advisor thinks the application of this bill is too broad and should be limited to specified areas of decision making. The opposition is not happy at all. Head of National Unity Party, Benny Gantz, remember, in the polls, he's seen as the biggest rival to Prime Minister Netanyahu. He sees this as the first step towards curbing judicial checks on government power.
Right, Jody, and the government says that the judicial reform is meant to control what it has been calling an overly interventionist Supreme Court. But we have seen this bill, as you've mentioned, trigger massive protests. What are we expecting in the weeks to come?
So opposition head Yair Lapid, he's called on Netanyahu to stop this bill, to fill the remaining MP position on the Judicial Selection Committee and to return to the talks. Remember, the opposition recently paused the talks being led by President Herzog until the Judicial Selection Committee can resume their activities. The coalition wants to fast-track this bill to become law before Parliament's summer recess. The coalition actually says that the opposition agreed in principle to limiting reasonableness clause in the talks, which Lapid's party denies, and Benny Gantz's party is saying that they can't accept piecemeal legislation and need to agree on everything before advancing any bills. Meanwhile, this weekend, as you said, we've seen 25 weeks now of protests. They're not on the scale like we've seen previously before the talks, but it remains to be seen how the bill, whether or not the talks progress, and also how the protesters will respond.
Right, Jodie, thank you very much for bringing us all the latest details coming out of Israel.
Thank you.